and welcome to PAX. My name is Wade Rockett, and if you recognize my name at all, it's probably because you subscribe to Koebel Quarterly and have seen me in the masthead. That is about my only claim to fame, aside from being one of the few corporate PR people that most tabletop designers know and can tolerate. So I end up working with folks like Pelgrane Press, with 13th Age, with Koebel Quarterly and Open Design. Recently I've been doing a lot of work on 13th Age, which we're going to talk about a little more, just a little more, very soon. And as we were planning for PAX, I noticed kind of a trend in online conversations when people were talking about 13th Age, which is one of the things that we said about it when the game went into the playtest was it's an attempt to kind of capture an old school approach or aesthetic while also kind of moving the D20 art forward. So it was, well, it was kind of an old schoolish game with some modern design. And I noticed that a lot of people online were mentioning 13th Age in the same breath as Dungeon World, kind of accomplishing the same thing. And I thought, you know what would be cool is if we could kind of do a 13th Age Dungeon World panel at PAX. And so everybody agreed, and here we are. So let's just go down the road. This is about as much as you're going to hear me talk, because you're probably not here to hear me. You're here to hear these fine folks. So let's just go down the road, and perhaps you can introduce yourselves and talk about why you were on a panel talking about old school games and modern design.
My name is Heinsoo, and I got weirdly lucky and started playing old school D&D in 1974 when it was an original brown box. I didn't understand the rules, and there was nobody else in the state of Kansas who really did either. So I did things like draw slips of paper out of a chitty chitty bang bang cup to like equal die rolls. I made up I used a Napoleonic's war game to make a combat system I could understand, and so forth. So I was playing so old school I wasn't even in school, and then eventually I managed to meet people who do polyhedral dice. So I design games of all types, like board games and card games, and sometimes role-playing games. And been working at 13th Age with Jonathan Tweet, and also a little bit with Logan, which he can say later.
I'm Adam Koebel. I'm the attractive half of the Dungeon World design team. I was not born in 1974. My first version.
I've had this happen a few times lately where it's like, I'm like, woo!
My first version of Dungeons and Dragons was AD&D, first edition. I got a big box of used books from my uncle. There's some heavy metal magazines in there. And yeah, I've
not that was important or anything.
It's very important.
Yeah.
The thing about old school that I'm attracted to is the aesthetic, right? Which is why I mentioned the heavy metal magazines, because it's a style. There's a very specific kind of art and fiction that comes from old school games. So that's what I'm doing here.
I'm Logan Bonner. I've worked with Rob both on D&D and on a little bit of 13th Age stuff. I'm primarily involved with the online game. I've also hung out with these guys, played some Dungeon World with them. Currently working at Heinsoo on Pathfinder, which is a different animal.
So I'm the smart half of the Dungeon World design team. My name's LaTorra.
You did let him speak after you.
I know,
you did start with that.
Set him up.
Geez. I wasn't born in 1974 either.
Yeah, I forgot to mention I wasn't born in that.
Honestly, I came to early editions of D&D after playing more recent editions, so kind of changed my perspective. Designed Dungeon World. And somehow got that involved in it. Like, how did that work out? My first experience with D&D was 3rd edition. And the books were staggered, so it was just the player's handbook, which had some monsters and like some idea of how to DM, a little insert kind of thing in the back. The first adventure I ever ran was for my brother, and it was using the fold-out map that came with it, and I didn't have any idea what to do. So the first room had a kobold in every 5-foot square.
As it should.
Yeah. Kobolds in every square, and then first level character, what do you do? And yeah, that was a short to the game.
Was it good prepared? Only scored king, right?
Well, and I was born before 1974, and I entered the hobby at age 14. That was 1980, and it was first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I played a little bit of Basic that a friend got a copy of. And kind of similar to you, my friend Chris was my DM, and I was the player, and we were under the impression that the way to play D&D was you actually acted out what happened. And so we would get out plastic swords and hit each other, and then if we connected, then you roll a d20 and see if you actually hit.
You're playing hardcore.
It was really confusing when other people joined our group. It's like, why are you hitting me?
I play games like that.
So when you did spellcasting, did you guys do a different thing, or were you fighters?
I was an assassin, so there was some backstabbing, but no spellcasting.
No spellcasters were involved, because that was not really matched. You were waiting for someone to come get you magic.
There's a lot of there's gasoline.
Yeah.
Fire, a mister.
Fire good.
Burning hands actually went to the hospital.
I was good thing the book shows you how to hold your hands. Like, that was an important part of the book for that.
That was good.
And after that, I got into other games like Champions, like Call of Cthulhu and so on. And then I was out of the hobby for a long time in the 90s and came back to D&D with 4th edition. And kind of was rediscovering RPGs. And one of the ones that I discovered was Old School Hack, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around in some ways because it is clearly not an old school game, but it somehow captures a lot of that feeling that I had back in 1980. And so maybe that's the jumping off point is, I mean, what is this old school thing and what is this modern design thing and how do they interact? What are your takes on that?
So,
pick one. Old school.
No, I'm going to talk over everybody. Everybody go first.
Yeah. Rob, what's old school?
Okay, I am never a person who likes to give one answer, so I'm going to really hold myself in.
Pack a lunch.
Pack a lunch. Now I'll try to make it fast. Many times old school is the first games people remember and had a great time with. So the answer is that there's definitely a case for simpler mechanics that are... Now, in the old days, they were simpler because we didn't know any better, and we were figuring out what mechanics were. And so there's a weird part of it where sometimes I think some of the games that I loved most back when, that I consider sort of old school, they're actually terrible games. You know, I can't play them. And so the only way I think that old school really goes wrong is when it gets used as an excuse to make a bad game. You know, it's sort of like, hey man, the games were all terrible the first time we played them, and we still had fun. And that's, so the thing is this, it's just like, you can have an amazing amount of fun with, quote, bad games that are poorly designed. Now, the best old school games, on the other hand, are ones that sort of like evoke the type of imagination that was used early in our world when we were closer to daydreaming and playing cops and robbers with our friends, and we didn't quite have as many, perhaps, hugely published worlds to go ahead and tell us, no, this is what everything is like. And so, to end what I'm saying, I would say that one way that 13th Age is a bit old school is that we're only trying to present half a world. We're saying, here are some things that are true, but we don't want to tell you everything about the elves. We don't want to tell you everything about the Corvu BMS. We don't want to tell you everything about this icon, because the entire point when people make up their characters is they're supposed to make it up. They're supposed to make up things that come into that campaign and set that campaign apart. I think that's how old school games did it a little bit more. Things were less defined at the beginning, so I don't know if
that's how we got a lot of the things that ended up being core parts of the thing later.
Yes.
Like Mordenkainen wouldn't exist if it hadn't been a player making that character who then became enmeshed in the...
And so I think sociologists call it the institutionalization of charisma. The original the original charismatic leader is there, things happen, and then people decide to keep the message going, and that's where it gets institutionalized. I think if you're doing an old school game, you're partly trying to tap into, let's get back to the core of creativity where everyone at the table is making stuff up instead of interpreting a published product.
Well, there's a mechanical element to that too. I mean, if you look at basic D&D, it's not just leaving the setting stuff open. I mean, the basic books didn't have really any setting. You knew that there were elves, you knew there were halflings, you knew you could cast spells and fight monsters, but all of the setting was missing. But you see it in the mechanics too, that it'll say, these are the core mechanics you need to play. This is the stuff that the game is about. Everything else, I don't know, roll a d6, figure it out, right? So it would leave space. And what's happened is that as games have developed along that line, people have, like you said, institutionalized mechanisms to fill those gaps. So that's why you end up with 400-page core books that have rules for swimming in them, because that's something that at some point in the history, someone decided that's an important rule, I'm going to put it in my game.
Yep.
So going back to the old school is leaving gaps, right? It's leaving space for the game, not only narratively, but mechanically to expand within it. Which is why I think people like the kind of old school as much as they do, because it's eminently hackable, right? You can put your own stuff to it.
Well, I think old school is inspiration. Like this is, it's kind of what you're talking about with a half world, except for Dungeon World. We don't even really have a half world. We have the kind of multi-base style, like, there's dwarves and elves and stuff. There's some implications, like dwarves appear to be kind of short, stout, tough people. Go from there. Like, where it's very much about giving you the tools to do something cool, because the stuff that was cool at our table isn't necessarily going to be as cool at yours, but if we can give you the tools to do some of the same cool stuff, to draw ideas out of people, to share those ideas, to make them into a shared creative thing together, that's awesome. That's what we're trying to do as designers, is to provoke inspiration, kind of, to provoke sharing of ideas.
So then, what would the modern design side of the equation be? Where does modern design start?
I think a lot of it is, like, the biggest part of game design is psychology, is knowing, like, oh, if we make this rule, people are going to feel bad when they play our game, versus this is going to create interesting situations. Like, I know you guys, with the engine you use, one of the big things is failure being interesting and being significant. So a lot of, like, making sure that everything you do in the game matters. Whereas, older designs, it might be like, oh, well, you invest these character points or skill ranks and things that might never matter. It's kind of stripping it down to just the stuff that is really exciting.
Well, modern design is modern design. That's like a tautology, but it's all the things that have happened since these games came out originally. Like, there are some brilliant things in older D&D, but to say, like, it's kind of like saying that the Apple IIe was a great computer. Like, it was for the time, and there are still things about it that we should remember are great. But we can also look at all the modern things that we've learned and build some of those same great experiences using modern tools that will also, make it faster and color. I don't think we had color on the 2E. Like, all these, we can add all these things that we've developed ways to do now. And it's kind of, RPG design is kind of discovering new technology. So we've discovered all these cool ways, and really I haven't discovered any of them. Other people did, and I put them in my game, our game. Things like making failure interesting, and these provocative questions, and all kinds of stuff.
I think that I was involved in a lot of miniatures games, and I'm back in my secret heart, I'm a wargamer. I mean, I played a lot of Advanced Squad Leader and all those things. But when it comes to actually doing role-playing, I don't really want to be moving on a grid. I mean, I don't want to, because it gets in the way of of seeing the story and just figuring out what's going on and telling people what's happening, because then the whole question is, you can't do that because you're in that square. Yes, I mean, there was a reason that 3rd edition did really well having the grid and making it work, and it served a really important purpose. But when it comes to, like, the old school aspect, I'm really happy going back to the days where it's like, look, a character is either engaged, nearby, or far away from somebody, which then gives, I think what you talk about your system, like allowing failing forward and stuff to be in there, it's like, then that gives me the room to be able to have the storytelling mechanics that are part of characters' backgrounds and their personalities actually have a interesting mechanical effect on the game, possibly, because there's space for it. You're not worried so much about exactly where you are. You're worried about, is this situation relevant to my background as a temple assassin? And if the answer is yes, then something good could happen there. Or is the Elf Queen related to this? Because that's my kind of a good relationship with. And I think that in one sense, the old school, maybe this works for you too, but one part of old school modern design is take some things out so that simpler things that feel cooler to the story can take their place.
It's also, whenever you get more detailed, like whether it's putting things on a grid or really closely defining, what things people know, it's a lot easier to say no to things. It's a lot easier to say, oh, we're on a grid. Well, your movement, you just can't get there.
Yeah.
Whereas if somebody's like, I want to get there, you can make it happen a lot more easily if the rules are not as in-depth.
That's right.
And restrictive.
Well, and all the story stuff, this is actually a funny anecdote. we've banned the word story from talking about Dungeon World because it gets all these connotations of like, well, there's story, like there's characters and character arcs and climaxes and stuff. And that's not what we want people to think about while playing the game.
I want people to think about climaxes in my game.
Well, if you'd like to climax while playing Dungeon World, the idea is that...
I rolled an 8.
It's a tough compromise.
There's a cost assigned to that.
So the idea there is, oh man, I'm completely lost.
Yeah.
Story. Dungeon World will be printed in a laminated edition.
We don't use the term story because that's not what you're trying to think about. The idea of Dungeon World is you can think as your character and describe what your character does, and you don't have to think about like, oh, is this going to make a good scene? Like you're in a situation, you react as your character, and that creates interesting things. So we've set the game up, hopefully, so that these interesting things happen. Like you don't have to think about making interesting things happen; they're built into the game.
And that's because it follows the, I played Apocalypse World.
Yes.
It follows the pattern of using the particular, what do you call it, things the character can do.
Yeah, so we
moves.
Yeah.
And they're all tied to, like, the Dwarf Fighter has his moves, the Wizard has their moves, and they fit in a certain sense with the story. They're going to, if you use them, create the kind of events that should happen.
Exactly.
Okay.
Like we don't have to think about story as something that we're trying to create because it's the events that are going to happen are going to make sense as a story. Because all a story is events that make sense one after another. Like that's going to happen from the game, from the rules. And we should give a lot of credit. Like Dungeon World wouldn't exist without Apocalypse World, which is the game that we're entirely based on, and most of the good ideas are not ours.
You're not based on any other games.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, we're not based on any. Yeah, the word dungeon there doesn't apply. Yeah.
It's interesting that in this discussion, the idea of grid-based versus gridless combat comes up when we're talking in the context of modern design. Because again, going back to me in junior high in 1980, we didn't play with miniatures. We didn't play with grids. That sort of theater of the mind combat to me says old school. But again, as the PR guy for 13th Age, where I'm reading blogs and looking at
really
forums,
old school
people
is
are
so
saying,
schizophrenic, right?
Yeah.
It's
Sort of like,
oh,
is this
use
modern
the
or is
chainmail
this-
rules for combat, right? It's like,
Yeah.
it's totally both and just a complete mishmash. And it's also, the further back you go, the harder it was for people to get the props and materials that are talked about in the book. So it's like, old school means so many different things, like especially with graded combat or not. It's just great.
Well, in old school for us, we were starting our Kickstarter and we wanted to put something other than the words dungeon and world in the title. And we went back and forth on this forever. I still don't know if we ended up with old school style modern design or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still not sure if that actually is like a great description.
It's practically the title of this panel.
Oh, I know. Well,
I was trying to figure out what to call the panel, and thankfully,
exactly.
perfect.
I'm actually not 100% behind those terms. Like, I don't like drawing those kinds of lines, but it does also kind of describe us.
The thing, too, though, is that we're drawing on a collective idea of what is part of a game. When we talk about, and this is something that's come up before talking about Dungeon World, that if I say you have there's a party of adventurers, and one of them is an elf, and they're a wizard, one of them is a human, they're in plate mail, they've got a holy symbol. Like, you can figure this stuff out without us having to explain to you every time, this is what a wizard is, this is what wizards do, these are elves, they live in the forest. Right? There's room to customize it, but we're drawing on sort of a collective unconscious about the genre. There's an aesthetic that's built in regardless of the fine details. So while, dark elves might be blue in one game, and they might be yellow in another game, and they might be green in another game, they're all, the same concepts are all there.
Well, we call them deep elves because we don't want to be too, I think dark elves are a little sketchy, just calling all the dark, evil people from underground, yeah.
But we have this freedom to draw on that and to customize it, and it skips over a lot of this stuff. Like, Dungeon World doesn't have a setting, because you all know the setting of Dungeon World. It's going to vary from table to table, but you already know what it is.
To the extent where if you're a cleric, you're picking your own god.
Yeah, exactly. So we
I
give
assume
tools
that's
for
still
customization.
Oh yeah, that's still very much a part of it, and this is deliberate because we're not just saying, oh, make up a god. There are prompts there to help you make a deity that's interesting in a fantasy adventure kind of way. And when we describe the wizard, instead of having like a page of text talking about, oh, wizards study for a long time and stuff, we've got this short, like 3-paragraph description that's really punchy and evocative. That was Adam's part. And then we've got rules that describe what it does. And the way the rules work in Dungeon World, we're describing fictionally what it does, not like you can make an attack at 30 feet for a will save. Like it describes that you have spells, these are how spells work, and that is the same thing as describing the rules. So all we describe is a short evocative bit and what it does, and that's enough to define a wizard. Like everybody knows Harry Potter and Gandalf, and you can go from there.
I think we've stuck deliberately, in a certain sense, far closer to the tree from which we've fallen. Like, we decided to go ahead and make the game feel familiar to people who've been playing D20, dungeon, fantasy, roll the die, add your level, and a stat games. And we wanted to do that, but in the old, in a sort of the old school sense, in the early days of games, there was no organized play, and there was no necessary requirement to have everything make perfectly legal sense. Different tables, like the East Coast people when they started playing D versus the West Coast people, the San Francisco people when they met the LA people, giant culture shock. They weren't playing the same game. People would, at that time, didn't realize that a character was supposed, well, a character wasn't from a campaign. They would, like, a guy would show up and say, here's my character sheet, and I have these magic items. And everybody would look at him, are you kidding me? Where did you get those? You know, well, my game master gave them to me. Now, they might have been lying. They might have been the equivalent of the cheat code, you know, from computer era. But what they were doing is that they were playing their own games that were very much, you know, their own tailored thing. I think in a certain sense, what we're doing with 13th Age is we're saying, look, you're playing a D20 game, but there's multiple different ways. Like, if you're a tiefling, and you want, and your racial power is some monster rolls a 1, you figure out what the curse they get is. You want to play a wizard who has Vance's polysyllabic verbalizations, you make up a fun name for your spell, and it just has extra impact on the spot. You know, I mean, it's like, but you've chosen that stuff for your character, which is kind of like the modern design, where you're like, I'm spending one of my talent slots in order to be able to do that fun improv. But the players, I guess I would say the players who want to avoid improv in our game can. And people who want to be all about it, you know, that's their choice. They can be all about the improv. I think, which is a little bit like, I think the moves you guys have are fantastic because they do mean that everybody fills their role in a certain sense.
Well, and we've deliberately fallen a bit further. We almost got rid of...
yeah, exactly. You jumped.
Yeah, we jumped.
You jumped.
Well, and part of that's coming from Apocalypse World. Like, we don't have initiative. HP doesn't go up with levels by default. Oh, geez. No D20s? Yeah.
Wait, what?
Oh, these guys are leaving.
Yeah, no, what?
Sorry, guys.
D20s are my favorite.
But that's kind of one of the anchors for 13th Age, to kind of calm people down who are weirded out. Is like, but you roll a D20 to hit things. It's like, oh, okay, good. Yeah, we're understand that.
Pay attention to the shiny die. Exactly.
As Adam has proven.
Yeah. We already talked about climaxing in our game, so if you're not weirded out already, no 20s. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, we should mention that all these games, you can play them here at PAX. Over main convention hall, 3rd floor, right around room 305, 306. These games and a lot of other cool games, including Apocalypse World that Dungeon World is based on, some other Apocalypse World race games that are amazing, all there. So come by and play.
That was room 305?
305 and 306. And the 13th Age guys are right there with us.
Yes, cool.
So one of the things I find interesting with 13th Age is that, like you were talking about, you know, the hack and slash person can play it pretty easily, and the theater of the minds, fancy pants actor can also play it easily. Is the way that the backgrounds.
You seem to have made a judgment.
Well, the term theater of the mind, like, that is the worst term ever.
I roleplay the hack and slash person as much as you roleplay the hack and slash person. So the way the skills or backgrounds are set up is you could do, you know, I was the 3rd heir of the house of Balderdash. Yeah, that could be your skill, or it could be
that is your background,
or it could be skull splitting, right?
Or it could be skull splitter for the street mob.
Yeah,
but then that becomes that gets added to all the skill checks where it seems relevant.
Right.
And the story I like to. Oh, go
but
ahead.
It's like
sorry.
You could say murdering is one of them. Or you could
I would usually tell a player, try to like tie this in and enrich my game.
Or you could tell them, you know what,
Murdering
you will be
orcs?
if you can say like what kind of murderer
That's
you are
right.
and who you work for, then your character has more skills. So you know,
difference.
that's how you deal with the power game.
I don't do premeditated murder.
Non-premeditated murder. Wow. I mean, honestly,
My fighter is actually a serial killer. Just
But,
like-
but let's say your GM is a little cooler than Rob and like lets you do play what you want to play. You could go with the more
like Jonathan Tweet.
yeah. You could choose a skill
Whoa.
that's more 3rd edition-y or 4th edition-y and roll
yeah,
with that.
you could definitely. Sorry, Logan.
We're not any edition-y. So.
The thing,
We don't have
so,
skills.
and this is coming up pretty regularly. That it's like the stuff that 13th Age is doing around character customization. We've taken another sort of leap forward away from a skill list, away from that kind of thing with Dungeon World, where the I would say arguably the core principle for the GM, the rule that the GM always has to abide by more above and beyond anything else, is to ask questions and build on the answers. That's the like key advice for the GM. So this happens every time I demo Dungeon World. I'll hand out the character sheets. Everybody will make their character. Everybody gets really excited. We start playing, and I'll be like, all right, you see a goblin, and he's like chirping at you in some language. And everyone immediately looks at their character sheet to be like, do I speak goblin? Where's the character sheet? I can't. And I'm like, so does anybody speak goblin? And just blank. Terror. And then I'll say to someone like, well, I don't know, like you told me your character was, a dwarf. You're a dwarf, you're a miner. You lived in the tunnels. You probably ran into a goblin. You speak goblin? And they're like, yeah, I totally do. And so we had a game. I
In
demoed.
another sense, that what you're saying is that you are needing to empower people who have been shut down.
Yeah.
No. Those words make me really uncomfortable.
Excellent.
They make me
Because they're so
uncomfortable because we're
true.
talking about because like the idea of empowering players and stuff. It sounds like it's a like finite power. Like we got to empower them because otherwise this person doesn't have power. Like
No.
there's no power going on.
No. It's okay. It's just like
Reminding them
It's
of
telling,
their-
reminding them that their imagination can.
There's supplemental.
It's prompting.
Well,
Yeah.
And honestly, like there are some players who they're gonna feel uncomfortable being in that spotlight. They're gonna say, I just I don't care. I don't care about this detail. I just want to do my thing, and that's fine too. If the GM says, tell me something about your character, and you're like, I don't know, then someone else can pipe in, or you can say it, or you can discuss it at the table, or say, you know what, it's not important, and move on to something
Well,
else.
and I know that Rob's GMing style is very much about getting people to go further and draw out more.
Yeah.
Right.
Rather than
Trying to do
looking
that.
at-
And I think I understand what you're saying, that Dungeon World specifically.
Right, and that's the
Yes.
thing. We don't give GM advice. We don't talk about GMing style. We say, this is how you GM Dungeon World. If you do not follow these rules, you're doing it wrong.
Well,
No,
so
it's- it's
we've
true.
softened that. We said we don't guarantee what will happen if you don't do it this way. If you do it this way,
So, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Money back.
You broke the warranty seal. You're on your own. That being said, there's an entire chapter devoted to how to change those. If your group isn't about asking and answering questions, we give advice for changing the principles and the agenda that the GM follows. So your game might
These
be a
are
little
the
bit
proper
different.
ways to play our game incorrectly.
Yes, exactly. If you're going to play Dungeon
you're gonna be
World
wrong.
your way,
Right.
these are the tools to help you do that in a way that'll be supported as if you were playing it according to the rules that we laid out.
and to me, this is one of the biggest parts of modern design is that for a long time the GM was kind of originally there was actually some really strong GM advice. Mold Bay is the only version of D&D I've ever seen that tells you how to start a game. Like it actually tells you procedurally, not just like start a game with your friends. It tells you this is how a game starts, which for Mold Bay is outside a dungeon, doors to a dungeon. Like that's where you start. But it actually tells you that. And over time, the GM kind of became this magical like mystery cult thing where you became a good GM and people came to bow at your feet and learn from you. And we stopped actually writing. This is how this game is run because it's not the same for all games. And this is something that modern games, Mouse Guard, Burning Wheel, Apocalypse World, because that's
Yeah,
what we got it from.
modern games do not give a shit how you GM. They say, this is how the game works. You're going to adapt these things on your own, but these are the rules. Because like Sage said, there's become this divide where if you're a good player, you know the rules, you can effectively play your character, you can leverage those mechanics, and that's how you're a good player. But if you're a good GM, you're some strange wizard who has magic powers no one else can understand, and you have to be the GM every time because no one else can ever be a good GM.
And which is why I'm sort of moderately comfortable with terms like empower players, because I feel like we are sort of in this transitional period from GM as God, the great and mighty Oz who has all these powers and knows all this stuff, and we are now kind of telling people, you know, it wasn't always like that. It really, really doesn't have to be like that. And then I think maybe in a few years we won't even need to talk about who's empowered and who's not, because it's just
the
game.
thing that makes me nervous is that then some people recently in various major designs have been talking about empowering the DM again. Like, we've got to empower the DM. We've got to empower players.
Really?
Like, I don't know what mention it because it's been publicly reported. 4th edition, or sorry, D&D Next has been talking about we've got to empower DMs.
Because the players are robbing the GM of all their power.
No,
poor GM is sad and alone, and they just pick the players.
The PAX East about the future of D&D has these comments about we're empowering the DM again. They may make them again, and they
really? I didn't know this.
You know,
I actually am deliberately not paying any attention to D&D Next. So
okay, no, this has been a major topic of discussion, and what makes me nervous is it turns into a power struggle. Like, this game's going to give the GM more power, and this game's going to give the players more power.
It's kind of slang terminology. It's being misused, maybe.
Empowering the DM against the rules, not against other players.
Oh, then why are we against the rules? Like, why are you playing with the rules if you don't want to work with them? Like, if you don't want the rules, throw them out. There's no reason to.
Well, so yeah, that's the thing. I mean, like, what's come to be called Rule 0 or whatever. They're like, if you don't like the rules, throw them out. Why did I buy the book in the first place?
Exactly. This is why we sorry. I should let you talk.
It's fine.
This is why we have SGM rules and stuff, and we tend to tell, like, there's nothing in the book except for, there's a chapter about adapting the rules, but there's not a chapter about ignoring the rules, because all the rules are there for a reason. Like, we think these all work together. And we're not going to tell you to buy our book because we want to make money and then not use our rules, because what the hell did you get out of that? We got money, but I'm not sure what you got.
I got the satisfaction of giving us the
So our attitude's a little bit different, I think. It's close, though. We have the thing is, you guys are coming. I'm going to safely say, because you've come from Apocalypse World, and then you're coming more from indie games world.
Oh yeah.
And we're from a culture that's more D20, D&D world.
Indie games world is a strange and terrifying place.
Or not even strange and terrifying. Not terrifying at all. Utterly unknown.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So the thing is that some of the things that we're using in 13th Age. I mean,
You've sent a ship to this distant land.
I had playtester feedback.
It's brought back some.
I had playtester feedback with a guy going,
spices,
"You got this from this game, this from this game, this from this game, this from this game, this from that game." I really don't see why I should have to buy your game since I have all those already and I could do it myself. And I'm like, yes, sir, you can. You are completely right. These concepts are borrowed from the indie. But so the funny part is, we're at a transition point where we're sort of like going, hey, look, there's things in indie world that can actually really, really help over here. Now, Sage, I understand why you don't feel good about empowering. I didn't know the history of the current. I will say that one of the funniest things for me running demos of 13th Age and campaigns is that we tell characters you get one unique thing. And the people who come from the say organized play world are very
They're looking for a list of
well,
unique things.
no. They're just very cautious. They don't want to. They want to tell me something like, well, here's the big one, the bastard son of the emperor, and that's who I am. Meanwhile, Ash over there, is like, my body is composed of the water of the Iron Sea as I rage, and the Lich King built me as a weapon against the Emperor, and I pull my heart out and cause magic. That's a one unique thing. Okay then. And so. But what ends up happening is that, and I actually have to go back and rewrite some of the Game Master advice, and I'll see if I can. But what I am saying is that it's very interesting that the previous D20 games have taught people that you can't just take cool things and make them yours, and so that's one of the things that I know your game obviously gets people to do that right away, but we're trying to communicate to an audience that's accustomed to being, told that they shouldn't. Now, I have to admit, when 4th edition had this line in it that says something like, the Game Master's answer should always be yes. I personally don't agree with that. I actually say more that the Game Master's answer should be, yeah, if you're willing to do this for me. That's much more my style, It's like, it's not an unconditional yes.
We can make that happen.
We can make that happen in so many ways.
That's a GM rule in Dungeon World. So when everybody, as a GM, you make moves, we call them, when under certain conditions, in particular when people look at you to find out what happens next. So like when somebody says, like, how can we kill the undying god or whatever, and as the GM, one of the things that you're told to do is tell them the consequences or price and ask. So you're like, oh, no, you can kill the undying god, but first you've got to go to hell and find it. You know, you build these situations, and in a lot of ways, that's the core of all role playing. Is this conversation of I want to do this, and then somebody else says, yeah, okay, but, or yeah, you can, and like that's the entire conversation of role playing, and that's what we've tried. What Vincent Baker, who wrote Apocalypse World, really did, and we built on, is turn that conversation into something that you don't have to think about as much. You don't have to think about the yes ands because they're kind of baked into the rules some of the time, and it makes things a little easier on you because always figuring out what that and or but is. And now I'm talking about butts and climaxes. So
the risk
Dungeon World, climax.
The risk inherent in such an open system for player contribution is that your game has to either take a step back from the sort of laundry list of skills and powers. Ugh, I can't even say those two words together. The laundry list of stuff. You either step back and say, this isn't what that game is about, or the list has to be 7,000 pages long, so that every conceivable thing that a player could come up with is somewhere buried in that list. Our approach, obviously, is to just give the GM the tools to react to these things, but it's going to be handled, differently. You can make whatever kind of character you want in GURPS, but you got to have the right book for it, and probably a math degree too to be able to make it. But with a game like Dungeon World and some of the games that are its contemporaries, it's more about the GM being able to think on their feet and to use the tools that we've given them to build the world around the players and their choices.
Well, and this is something that's kind of old school. The GM is instructed to, their first job is to portray a fantastical world. And that's something that it takes sometimes a little bit of getting used to. It took some getting used to for me, but it leads to things like our invisibility spell literally says, you turn invisible. Like that's
the full description of the spell.
Well, we had to add to it because people kept on saying, "What does invisible mean?"
It means no one can see you.
So the spell now literally says, "You turn invisible." Period. No one can see you! Exclamation point.
Cool. that's the errata for that spell. Just so everyone knows.
Like it.
Because we got the GM, if they're not used to trying to portray the world, are like, okay, so what's the mechanical bonus for being invisible? And that's not what this spell's supposed to do. It's supposed to turn you invisible. Like, who cares what the mechanical bonus is? That can fall out of it because you're portraying the world, and so you portray that world. When somebody's invisible, you can't see them. Guess what?
Right, and that only works for us because the framework is so open. If we had a system in the game that required knowing how much harder it was to hit someone who's invisible versus someone who isn't, we'd have to provide that support, that framework. And we didn't want to write that game, basically. But it's not to say that it isn't a viable option. It just means that as a game designer, you have a lot more work ahead of you to build that supporting framework for your players.
So we have about 15 minutes left, and so I'd kind of like to open up the floor to questions. And since we don't have a microphone, feel free to just speak up, and we will repeat the question back for our audio recording device.
And I think we might even, they told us that we might be able to stay in the room a little late, so we might have time for extra questions.
That's cool. Could I ask you guys a quick question? Like,
I thought we were asking them.
Yeah, no. So I want to ask one quick question.
Yeah, sure.
When you're the game master for Dungeon World, how much setup do you have, and how much are you surprised by what happens?
Oh, that's an interesting. Do you want to talk about
Well, it varies. Like prep, traditionally in a sort of dungeon-based game, prep tends to be kind of heavy, especially if you're going to go in and explore a dungeon because you got to draw the dungeon, or at least be familiar with the published adventure. You can do that with Dungeon World. You can have some prep, but again, one of the principles is to leave spaces. So what we'll often do is we'll take the general sort of outline of a map, and I'll do these for demo scenarios because you have to have a little bit more prep for those. But take a general outline of a map, ignore what's in the rooms, and just ask questions about character creation to sort of fill in the world and inform the prep from that. But I've been in games where the GM did no prep at all.
And was it totally surprised in a certain
Yeah. So the whole game was built from character creation and from just asking questions.
Because I know that the way 13th Age can be run is also like that in a sense that the game master ends up getting surprised by what happens because of the character's role-playing hooks. And I think I'm not positive in my brain if that's actually how. See, the funny thing is, I associate that myself quote with old school a little bit, but I'm not sure that's really how it was. It feels more like we wanted to plan things out, but we weren't good enough back then.
The thing,
so now the funny thing is,
the tool that old school games, especially old school D&D, had to provide, because the judge or the GM or whatever was supposed to be neutral. They weren't supposed to say, I want them to succeed or fail at this.
Yeah.
They're supposed to go in with no preconceptions, and to do that, that's what random encounter tables are for, right? Like if you have to check for a random encounter every 2 rounds, it doesn't matter if your players have 1 hit point or full hit points.
You're still going to check.
You have to make the check because that's the rule, right? But in a game that doesn't enforce that, you can look at your party and be like, I'm going to take pity on them, and then you're making judgments and you're pushing the game in a direction that it's your fiat, it's your call.
There's huge amounts of old D&D that from a 3rd edition, when I was still younger and that was the game that I compared it to, there was a lot of parts of it that I was like, why do I need to know the chance that there will be disease in a village or whatever? Like this seemed odd to me. But now looking at it, it's actually to help you build everything. Like it's actually a huge system. Like all these things about like, probably not the random prostitute table, but a lot of the stuff is there to actually create an interesting world and help you do all this stuff, and they actually have implications. Like the fact that there's a disease, since you're supposed to be in a lot of these games kind of portraying the world, then means that that's a problem to deal with. And just one other note or 2 notes on GMing in Dungeon World. Sorry. First, the GM is told to play to find out what happens. Like this is one of the core things that the GM has to do. Is you're there to find out what happens. You'll know some things ahead of time, but you're not going to know what's going to happen. And the GM, to know those things ahead of time, is given some tools to prepare. And we call those fronts. And there's some dungeon moves that'll help you create dungeons. And we have a section on translating old school adventures from whatever your favorite edition of D&D is.
Would you like me to get you the PDF and you can read it to them?
You can order Dungeon World today.
You can't. We're still editing it. We're still laying it out. But yeah, there are lots of tools to help you prep, because that's important. Go ahead.
Yes.
Just with the conversation you just had and the whole empowering the DM thing, it seems to me like a lot of the, at least with the D&D Next thrust, it's basically, and certain old school sensibilities are on removing responsibility of the events from the DM. It's not my fault you can't do this. It's in the rules. It's not my fault you're dead, though dice said that this monster ate you. And that seems to have dissipated with a lot of modern design, where it's a cooperation between the players and the DM to create a story that is interesting to everyone. Whereas in the past, it's like, okay, I'm going to just be here, and you may or may not die. Let's find out.
You may or may not die is an interesting thing. We originally
actually let me kind of repeat that for the audience on the internet. So the observation was that the old school approach seemed to be the GM or DM kind of abdicating responsibility to the rules and saying, well, tough. The reason you can't do that is because the rules say you can't. Whereas now it's more cooperative and collaborative between the GM and the players.
So for a while, monster damage in Dungeon World wasn't rolled, it was static. And we got a lot of feedback from people who got really antsy because there's not a roll to attack for monsters either. It's just an outcome that can happen from player actions. And so the GMs would get really nervous about they felt like too much responsibility was on them. So we have roll damage just so that you can declaim responsibility a little bit. And we have a lot of character death too. We don't have you don't have your characters in a special unique flower in Dungeon World. They may die. I had a paladin who died singing along to Pinball Wizard. Yeah, and he walked onto an exploding room, got blown across the room, and then skulls swarmed him and he died. That was it.
Well, but there has to be a twist.
I think the question, if I understand all the layers of the question, there's always been a tension between games where that D20 roll or that die roll really determines what ends up happening. There's no, the story like in Jonathan Tweet's Elisambra game for 3rd edition, we likened it to being every time we went into an encounter, because we knew Jonathan was totally neutral. He had just set things up. You had to go in and be like, you felt like you were cleaning your weapons 5 times, and then you went in, and if you forgot to do something, Jonathan would just be like, well, that's tough, and looks like the next 5 sessions will be about trying to find your character's heart.
So that style of adverse sort of like complete, but simultaneously somehow he was managing to weave it all into a story where there was an epic story in the background. I think that a lot of the stuff Robin Laws and a lot of other indie gamers talk about is that there are dramatic curves that are important. And I can't speak for Dungeon World, but I know that our game is still a roll the dice, but we're, like as a as an example of something I think that 13th Age may be adding to the tool set for people, I believe we've added an escalation die. And the escalation die says, as a fight goes on, you're heroes, and you're going to be more and more likely to hit, because every round that die goes up by 1, and that is added to the hero's attack bonuses. What ends up happening, therefore, is that the games that are entirely based on can you hit or not have in the past sometimes just sort of dwindled out. Like, we're playing every round of combat, I don't think anything interesting is going to happen here, this isn't fun. And 13th Age actually really doesn't have that problem. You know, things end, even though you're essentially playing a D20 style battle. That could be used in a lot of other games, and what ends up happening is you've added a dramatic curve to a results-based random game, you know, and so it's like you get both in a certain sense, which I don't know, I see as potentially useful for people who want that.
And a quick plug, by the way, Koebel Quarterly issue number 22, I believe, had an article by Rob that talked about how to port that escalation die to about 4 other games, I think.
I don't know, Adam, do we have a dramatic curve? Yeah, no, not so much. Yeah. my paladin, it was the big fight. I thought it was him walking in, like he thought he had the drop on the bad guy, he was going to smash him in the back of the head. He died and had to make Wesley the cleric with his crusher instead. So,
I'll say the dramatic curve, like, dragons also get the escalation die, and the number of player character groups who never run from anything except dragons is pretty.
I believe the fellow in the very back with his hand way up was first.
So when I think about an old school design, especially when it comes to lethality, the first one that comes to mind is Traveler, where you weren't even guaranteed to survive character creation. And on the flip side, if I'm thinking about sort of modern game design, especially where the mechanics are very tightly focused on the type of game, I think of it something like Dogs in the Vineyard, where pretty much your character is mostly only at risk of dying when you, the player, have decided that it's something your character would die for. So that seems to be a tension when we're talking about modern game design and old school. Where do you fall along the line?
I don't think it's a tension. We just decided you can die anytime. Like, that's the rule. Like,
the observation was between an old school game like Traveler, where you could sorry guys, it's
no,
the internet. Old school game Traveler, where you could die during character creation, versus Dogs in the Vineyard, where it's all about drama, right? Choices.
The thing is that in Dogs is an interesting example because as far as indie games go, it's a fairly early example. So there's been some refinement from there, but I wouldn't say that like lethality is tied to the situation of the game at hand. A game about violence and dying is going to have more death than a game like Dogs, where dying's not really a big part of the narrative.
Yeah, it's not the point.
Yeah, so in our emulation of the sort of dungeon crawl game, death obviously is important because it's part of that old school experience. Being afraid you're going to die is a big part of it.
You guys are like tapping into the feelings people had when, you know, the thief might just backstab you before you get to the dungeon.
Right, and we're including it because it's part of that aesthetic we're trying to emulate. If that wasn't a part of old school games, it wouldn't be in Dungeon World.
Yeah,
and to me, that's a big part of modern design, is designing for the game you want. Not like, oh, of course we have to have combat rules. Why can't, like, or of course we have to have initiative or whatever. It's focused design. You're not taking a lot of guarantees of we have to have these rules because, oh, well, it's a role-playing game.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's one of the people that I would like to like 13th Age. Jeff of Jeff's Game Blog said something at one point like, if an orc can't take out my first level character with one shot, I'm not interested. It's like, well, this probably isn't the game for him.
Depends on the orc.
That's true. He's a really big orc. Yes.
So when they talk about modern design versus old school design, a lot of what I hear sometimes sounds like old school design is oftentimes analogous with mechanics-driven systems, while new design, modern design, is analogous with like storytelling-driven systems. See, for example, like when people say modern, they're oftentimes talking like about a fate-based system or something along the or Apocalypse World, or is it on the flip side, the mechanics for like old school being like 4th edition or Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, where the dice are telling you. I was wondering, posing a question to both the 13th Age and the Dungeon World guys. Where's your ideal game on that spectrum? Does it marry the two? Does it go fully Does it go fully just storyline driven? Like, do you think mechanics driven systems have a place in modern game design?
Can you repeat the question and then I can ask you a question back?
The question, I believe,
That's right.
is where on the spectrum of mechanics driven versus kind of story driven is kind of your sweet spot for your game.
How is Apocalypse World not mechanics driven?
Oh, play the heck out of it, and sometimes it just really felt like we were just dictating. I mean, we had an invisible friend who was telling us this is how the story should maybe go. Well, what do you think you should do? But we were making most of the decisions.
Yeah, the thing is, it's what the mechanics are doing, because either of those is really mechanics driven. It's just, are the mechanics telling you how the world is working, or are they telling you how the story is progressing? In a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Like the mechanisms in something like Primetime Adventures are all about this is how the story is progressing versus like you're not going to roll to hit in Primetime Adventures.
Right. Yeah, and like 4th edition would be like, does the fireball kill these guys? The rules are going to tell us that, but they're not going to tell us how my character feels about it.
Right. Well, and they're not going to promote a character who has feelings about it. Right. Like, the rules don't have to tell you to feel things, but they can put you in a situation where you're going to think about feeling.
I guess I mean, one thing I feel about when a question includes the words "ideal game," I sort of feel, in this weird perspective, there are so many games that are worth playing, and there are so many ways to game that there isn't an ideal take on, for instance, the kind of game that I've been involved with, because
I don't
different
have one
people,
game I want to play.
Yeah, different people want to
do.
play different things. I mean, I think the reason, for instance, that Jonathan and I have designed 13th Age to be the way it is that, okay, we actually do like the crunchy roll the d20 and see what happens, but we wanted to have a system that would make character decisions about the story and giving new input to the game master from the very beginning matter a lot more, sometimes even during those battles and definitely in the rest of the campaign. And so that means that we wanted both, but at the same time, it's like I could be pretty comfortable playing a game that's completely story-driven, or, I'm not saying, like, the fact that I like 13th Age and have made it, I'm sort of like, there's reasons to play Champions, if that's really what you want to do. But for me right now, for the fantasy thing, this is kind of what I want to do. It's a synthesis. Now, when you said how is Apocalypse World, Dungeon World not,
or Apocalypse World or Fate, I think those are both very mechanical games, actually.
Well, they are, and here's the weird thing. I think the thing is that when mechanics are simple.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the deal. When mechanics are simple, or when a small amount of word count is at mechanics, people think of games as more storytelling necessarily than they really are, simply because they have more time to think about the story because there were fewer words to process. And that's just a weird thing. It's like our brains can handle this much information. If it looks really simple and it actually is totally mechanical, people will still think it's about story because that's what they're actually doing in their role-playing. So in a certain sense, it does mean that if you get the mechanics out of the way, people will have more time to think about story.
A lot of it is how
Does
much,
that make any sense?
How much your brain is thinking about any one thing. Like if you're playing Pathfinder, a lot of your brain space is going to how the skills work, or how the spells work, or how they interact with other parts of the system.
Yep.
And so you think of it less as a storytelling game just because your brain is not thinking about the story as much when you're playing.
You had to learn a bunch of terms like encounter level and character, CR.
You guys played Burning Wheel? Like,
well, no.
So
look,
I'm afraid to play Burning Wheel.
No, Burning Wheel. No, that's not the reason. Burning Wheel is exactly what we're talking about here. It's got tons and tons and tons and tons of mechanics.
But okay, I don't buy into like this story game divide and everything.
Sure.
But it's a game that has a lot to do with your character and their feelings and like it's character focused.
It's just that there are rules about that, right? Like you get experience for feeling things and doing stuff about those feelings.
And that works for some players. I mean, that's the thing. It's like the reason Burning Wheel is really interesting is because there are groups that do use those rules and have complete wonderful storytelling experiences that they remember as stories. Then there's other groups who are like, I got stuck in the rules.
Yeah, well, and what I'm saying is, I've played Burning Wheel, and it's always come out very narrative. Like, I could tell you guys, I could write a novel about some of those games. They're fantastic.
Right.
And the amount of time we spent reading rules descriptions and figuring out who goes first in a duel of wits, and like, so exactly what is my fort, and like, does my character die now? Like, all these things.
So you did that, but you still ended up with a cinematic experience afterwards.
So this divide between the mechanisms in play and the stories you remember after play is a huge part of why we started working on Dungeon World, because I have all of these stories in my head from when I was a kid of playing AD&D, and I remember only the awesome stuff we did, like the cool magic items I got and the badass monsters we fought. I don't remember how long it took me to look up whether my spear did 1 or 2 damage depending on what armor they were wearing. So we wanted to make a game that would play the way you remember playing D&D, that feels like you're telling those stories in the game and not after the fact.
One more question. Behind the black-clad gentleman.
It's not baseball jersey. Behind the guy in the black t-shirt.
So this segues nicely.
The gamer, please.
I'm loving what you guys are saying. This is awesome.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Not a question, but we'll take it.
So, like, my GM is really frustrating us right now. We're playing Pathfinder. He's so rules oriented. It's taking us an hour and a half to do a 5-minute combat.
Kill him.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I'm really attracted to this improvisational storytelling thing that the Dungeon World guys are in, and I really want to play it. Awesome. My question is, on the flip side of that, how do you guys keep it so that you don't lose the thread of the story? Like with improvisation, it's so easy to be telling the story and then it's like, oh shit,
we're going to have really different answers.
Yeah.
We're going to have very, very different answers.
The question is, in highly improvisational games, how do you hold on to that thread of the story and keep it coherent?
Yeah.
So we're going to have very different answers. You guys want to be first?
Well, the flip answer is game design, right? Is that we built the game around that. When people say improvisational or player driven, I think a lot of the time, if you're a GM, especially a GM of a more traditional game, there is a little terror that you're going to lose the reins of the game, because part of the GM's job in those games is to keep the players kind of focused and keep things going in a certain way. But the way that we do it is that ultimately, it's the GM asking for player input. They're mandated to do it in the rules, right? It's part of their job, and if they don't, they're not playing the game right. But they're mandated to do it. So there are situations in which the GM doesn't have to ask. The GM can say, this is something that I already know based on the prep that I've done about the world, so I'm going to just tell it to you, just like you would in any sort of more typical game.
Yeah.
So there's a valve for it, right? And different groups are going to find the flow of play. It's going to vary, right? Some games are going to be like heavily player-driven. Most of the players will be looking for the GM to incorporate that much stuff.
Well, and practically, like, you're not going to lose the thread in Dungeon World because it's always focused on a concrete fictional situation that everybody's dealing with. Like, you can talk, you can come up with, my dwarf fought goblins before, so he knows how to speak goblin. But all that's doing is adding that to the concrete situation of there's this goblin chirping at you, what are you doing? Like, the thread there is the concrete current situation, and you can't really lose that.
It seems like in Dungeon World, the way the thread would get lost would be if the player said, my character fought goblins on the moon, wearing, with blaster rifles, and everybody else was like, that's not the story we're playing. I mean, right? That's sort of like,
But that's something that gets established during character creation, right? Is that in the portion of the game where you're setting up for play, if the dwarf wants to say, I'm from the moon colony of dwarves,
can't do that.
And the GM can be like, the GM's doing their job if they say, that's awesome, let's roll with it.
Good.
You're a moon dwarf.
Got it.
There was a game at PAX last year where my friend John was running a game, sorry, we should let you answer. Santa Claus became the god for the cleric because it was her first time playing, and like Santa Claus, like that seemed like a god, like that might as well. Yeah, sure. And they ran with it, and it became actually kind of creepy. They were like, like the thread is hard to. You're people. You're going to talk. It's a conversation.
Yeah, the game is a conversation, right? And so you don't just jump into a conversation and derail it unless you're a total ass.
Santa Claus. That's not.
I guess 13th Age's answer is actually more similar to that than I would have expected. Yeah, it's similar. I mean, the two things is a lot of the improvisation comes at the beginning when you're making your character because you're choosing unique thing and backgrounds. Yeah. What those are, that's cues to the game master to telling the game master what you want the campaign to be about. Then the game master's responsibility is, over the course of the campaign, give everybody some of the things they want. And when it comes to improvisation during encounters and things like that, I think our rules, because they are based on a core of like, here's what you can do, there are sort of parameters that keep that in control.
Okay.
I mean, so it's I think it sounds like, compared to
It's also, 13th Age also has the icons.
Yes.
For kind of the pillars of your game world. That's kind of the setup for 13th Age.
Yeah, so those are kind
And
of
so,
anchors.
So
if you know what they're doing,
the 13 most
And you know how
powerful
the characters
non-player
relate.
characters in the world are people you have relationships with, and when you're low level, you probably have relationships with people in their bureaucracy or their organization or something. And what that means is it gives you a sort of a hook into the world, but it also lets the game master always be able to come to you and have story things that are going to like affect you because you have a positive relationship with the Archmage. So you're already hooked in.
Yeah.
So that the storylines then are, I think, probably in a certain sense, the icon's place might be similar to the tropes they're using for character moves, in the sense that it's interesting things that happen are already based in the story of your character, rather than just coming from left field.
Yeah.
And speaking as a 13th Age GM, it helps that there is that responsibility for storytelling is kind of distributed around the table. So I'm not the only one who has to keep track of what's going on. There are 5 other people who are keeping track of what's going on, and so that I have not experienced a derail like that.
Yeah, it's good to be able to, like, as game master for that game, for 13th Age, I sort of feel much less pressure because I know that the player characters are already trying to help me tell the story, and they're actually asked to do that. Now, that's just coming, the thing is, that's standard behavior in some indie games already. It's just that it's sort of a little bit of a new take coming into the D20 world.
Yeah.
So
13th Age sounds like a perfect gateway to other games.
yeah, it is, and perhaps it is a gateway that then would turn into a long, long corridor. But
Yeah.
still,
Well, and the other thing I was going to say too is that the way that we're developing Dungeon World, and this is derived from just sort of indie game design in general, is that all of the text, all the stuff we're putting into the game is Creative Commons. It's licensable. So if you, like, for example, if you take a look through the Dungeon World PDF, you see some rules or something you like, you can steal it. You can have it. Throw it in your game. Anybody can do it.
and that's interesting because 13th Age is also, the mechanics are open gaming license. Now, what's really weird here is the original game, they weren't, right? They didn't want to be, but part of the, I think that post OGL, the original one, there's an element of you want to be able to share and get people to be creative with this art. You don't want to go ahead and say, no, don't use it, you can't. You want people to be able to make it into something new.
Yeah.
Well, in ours, it's not just the mechanics, it's the text of the game. Like, you can take the text of the game and chop it up and do things with it. Like, because we didn't think that the mechanics really existed without the text. Like, the wizard is a set of moves and a 3-paragraph description, and if you, like, cut out any one of those things,
Not a full wizard.
it's not quite a full wizard. So we couldn't chop it up and, like, oh, you can have the rules, but all the rest of it. It's all, the game is the text.
Well, guys, I need to steal Rob because he has a game to run in a little bit. So I think I'd like to wrap this up now. But as Sage mentioned, we are all in the indie tabletop area, 3rd floor convention center. The 13th Age table is right outside the Tabletop RPGs on Demand room. Rob, Ash, and several other GMs are going to be running 13th Age there. Dungeon World, I believe you'll be running there.
Yeah,
as
sure.
well.
If people want it.
Logan, will we see you around?
I'm around.
Yeah.
I'll be there a lot.
Yeah, he'll be hovering around there. Also, 13th Age artist Lee Moyer, along with Aaron McConnell, will be doing the signing. Lee Moyer, ladies and gentlemen.
We're going to be doodling and sketching and talking about some of the weird ways that our process has gone and why we think that's made the game a lot cooler. And the importance to me as the art director as well as the painter of making a game with integrity and how that helps with design as well. So,
Yes, that's a whole panel in itself for next year, which is that they didn't just say, oh, draw a fighter. I was like, okay, we'll draw a fighter. They Lee and Aaron were very much a part of making the game what it is. So
we have got a dungeon world artist here who's not doing anything special, but she should stand up because she's awesome. Emily.
Emily, cool. Ladies and gentlemen, dungeon world artist.
Nice.
So please come and play our games. Thank you so much for being here.
Also, if anybody is interested in PDF of Dungeon World, come up, get a business card, send us an email, you can have it.
And we'll hang around for questions. Like we're not in our. They're in a hurry. We're not.
Yeah, we have postcards with voucher codes for free shipping on